Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
When my father stood up in the middle of that family gathering, cleared his throat, and with a face full of self-righteous certainty told me that it was time I stopped being selfish and handed my house over to my sister, the first thing that crossed my mind was not shock or even anger, but a quiet, bitter laugh that I kept to myself, because of course it would come to this. Of course he would stand there in front of cousins and uncles and neighbors and make a demand so outrageous it sounded like a parody of itself, and of course everyone else would nod as if it were perfectly natural that the woman who had worked for years to buy her own 5-bedroom home should suddenly give it away to the chosen child. I didn't answer him right away. I let the silence stretch, because I wanted him to squirm, and I wanted them all to remember that silence when the moment came that I opened my mouth and tore the illusion apart. I suppose none of it would have stung as much if it hadn't been the same story all my life. From the time I was old enough to notice, my sister Melanie had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose mistakes were brushed aside as youthful experiments, while mine were etched into the record of family shame. When she forgot her homework, Mom laughed and told the teacher she had been too busy practicing piano. When I forgot mine, I was scolded for being lazy. On birthdays, she was showered with gifts that sparkled under the living room lights, while I learned early to smile at the sweaters and discount store perfume that appeared in front of me. I never said much, because saying anything only turned the attention sharper, as if complaining proved I deserved less. Even as kids, the favoritism wasn't subtle. Melanie got ballet classes, summer camps, even braces the moment she needed them. When my teeth grew crooked, Dad told me to stop hiding my smile in photos and to show some confidence, as though confidence could straighten enamel. By the time I was 16, I was working part-time at a grocery store, folding my paychecks into a small envelope so I could buy my own clothes and put gas in a car I bought off a neighbor for $500. Melanie? She was handed keys to a shiny blue sedan on her 17th birthday, the kind of moment that makes a girl feel like a princess, while I was the one who had to drive her to school when she was too tired to do it herself. That's the sort of history that bleeds into every interaction, and by the time we were grown women, it wasn't just a pattern, it was a law of the household, one that everyone quietly accepted. What was mine was negotiable, what was hers was sacred. I thought that by leaving, by working hard, by climbing my way into a career that paid well enough to eventually put me in the position of buying a house that was more than a roof, more than an address, but a symbol of every sacrifice I had made, I might finally free myself from those rules. Yet here I was, standing in a dining room decorated with dollar store streamers and too many folding chairs, being told by the man who had barely contributed to my life past childhood that I was expected to gift wrap the single largest accomplishment of my adult life and hand it over with a smile. What stung more than the words themselves was the ease with which he said them, as if he had spent weeks preparing his speech, maybe even practicing the pauses, knowing that in his mind there was no chance I would refuse. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone who owes him money, not at a daughter who had built a life with her own hands. My mother's eyes darted between us, restless, nervous, but she didn't say a word. She never did. It was always Dad's voice that filled the house, Dad's anger that set the rules, Dad's praise that determined worth. I remember glancing around the table, noticing the way relatives shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak, because what right did they have to interfere in family matters? Even Melanie looked smug, lips curled into the faintest smile, the kind that told me she had known about this demand long before I did. She had been promised. She was already imagining herself in my home, decorating rooms she had never worked to earn, filling closets with clothes she had bought with other people's money, laughing about how generous her big sister had been. But here's the thing about silence, it gives you time to measure the weight of the room, to take stock of every pair of eyes watching, and to decide when and how to strike. I kept my composure that evening, because I had been waiting years for this stage to set itself, for the moment when my father's arrogance and my sister's entitlement would collide in such a perfect display that no one could pretend not to see the truth anymore. I knew something none of them did, something I had carried like a locked box in my chest, and though it would destroy more than one illusion, it would also finally shatter the chains they thought still held me. I didn't speak that night. I smiled faintly, shook my head, and told him that this wasn't the time for such a conversation, and I excused myself, letting them think they had won, letting them savor the taste of victory. Because revenge is sweeter when it's savored slowly, when you let the other side believe they're still in control. And as I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the sound of chatter and clinking glasses behind, I thought about the secret that had kept me silent for so long and about the moment it would finally break free. And though my father thought he was the one pulling the strings, he had no idea that I had been holding the sharpest knife all along. I did not sleep much the week after that gathering, not because my father's demand had surprised me, but because the old ache it awakened started to pull at other threads. And every time I closed my eyes I could see a timeline of small moments that should have meant nothing and yet built the exact scaffolding that made his speech feel inevitable, like the scene had been rehearsed for years while I, against my better judgment, kept pretending our family could still behave like a family if I just stayed calm, worked harder, and kept my head down. When people ask how favoritism works, they expect some single flaming incident, some obvious cruelty you can point to with a neat caption. But the truth is it seeps in gradually through petty reallocations of care. And I learned early that love in our house was a sliding budget item where Melanie's column overflowed while mine was audited for waste. So by the time we reached high school, everyone had already internalized that my sisters' ambitions were community projects and mine were private hobbies that should never require a line item from the family ledger. It was not that I lacked drive or talent or stubborn optimism. It was that every success required double labor and a layer of emotional camouflage. Because I could never celebrate outright without inviting the eye roll and the corrective speech about humility, whereas Melanie could announce a modest victory with a clarion trumpet and be met with catered cupcakes and an impromptu toast. And the absurd thing is that I did not even resent her at first. I resented the system that trained us both to believe this was sensible, especially my father who, with the confidence of a man who never questions his own fairness, would declare at dinner that resources follow potential and that some children simply offer a better return on investment. A phrase that made my mother flinch and made me store my allowance in a coffee tin under my bed, as if money only counted if it touched my hands twice. I remember one spring when I was 17 and working evening shifts at the grocery store, the same job where my manager timed our breaks with the zeal of a traffic cop and where I learned to stack fruit so perfectly the pyramids on the display never wobbled. And I wanted to buy a used laptop for community college classes because the one family computer had become a shrine to my sister's scholarship applications and social calendars, so I took on extra hours and skipped a school trip and finally counted enough bills on my bedroom floor to go to a pawn shop and point at a scuffed model that booted with a wheeze, but opened a word processor, and when I brought it home in a plain backpack hoping to avoid a scene my father still noticed, glanced at the brand sticker, and asked why I had thrown money at outdated junk when Melanie would need a new top-of-the-line machine in the fall, and wouldn't it be better if I simply saved my cash towards supporting that upgrade for the family? An argument so brazen in its logic that I laughed, then caught the look on his face and swallowed the sound because laughter in that room was a provocation. I would like to say that my mother stepped in with a balancing gesture, but she moved through those years with a delicate caution, as if she believed that managing my father's expectations kept the house from cracking in half, and perhaps in her way she was right. Because when she did object it happened at night behind a closed door where words carried differently, and one such night, late and thick with summer heat, I came home from my shift and paused in the hallway because their voices floated down the stairs not as a fight, but as something more tender and more dangerous, and my mother kept repeating that what he was asking was unfair to me, that he had to stop acting as if Melanie were the sun and the rest of us her orbit, and then, after a long pause that made me think the conversation was over, I heard her say, very softly, that he should be careful about demanding sacrifices in the name of a child who, though loved, did not belong to him in the way he believed. A sentence that sat so still in the air I thought I had misheard it until my father said nothing at all, which for him was an event. I did not burst into their room. I did not press my ear against the door like a teenager in a soap opera. I simply stood there with my hand on the banister wondering how long the floorboards had known what I had not, and whether my mother's gentleness was not cowardice, but a kind of penance, and whether my father's righteousness had been built over a foundation of fear he could never admit, because the admission would turn the entire house into a stage set. Even then I did not know the details. And I would not for several years, yet the shape of the secret slid into place like a key, and once you hear a key turn you cannot unhear the lock. If you are waiting for me to say that I confronted them right then, I did not, because years of training had taught me that dramatic truth without leverage is just a performance, so I tucked the knowledge away and let it guide a different kind of decision-making. One in which I stopped volunteering for the family rescue squad and started building small walls that looked like ordinary adult boundaries, and the first of these, which tasted like a small and necessary revenge, arrived when Melanie cornered me 2 months later with a bright idea that I should co-sign a private student loan extension because our parents were tapped out and her boyfriend's credit was complicated, and instead of giving the usual polite deferral I told her, in a voice so even it startled me, that I had checked my own credit and would not be tying it to anyone else's debt, then followed up by emailing the loan officer to remove my contact information from their file so that every future call had to go through our parents. And when the next week brought a round of raised voices about how unsisterly I had become, I let the storm pass without comment, because a good revenge in a long game often looks like a simple no. That no did not feel like cruelty or betrayal or spite. It felt like the first square of solid ground under my feet, and as I stood on it I realized that family myths survive only when everyone keeps paying the narrative insurance premiums. So I canceled mine quietly and watched, not without guilt, but with increasing clarity, as small gears shifted around me, and I promised myself that the next time my father tried to requisition my life for Melanie's comfort, I would not argue or plead or justify. I would bring the truth into the room and set it down like a lit match, though I knew that doing so would not only singe his pride, but set fire to the careful fabric my mother had woven for decades, which is why I waited, planned, and chose the moment with the care of someone who understands that payback is not a thunderclap but a controlled burn. By the time I turned 30, I had already stitched together the kind of career that no one in my family ever expected from me, not because I lacked the brains or the drive, but because their entire narrative had been bent around Melanie's future as though mine were simply filler material in the family script. I moved out as soon as I could, not in anger but in necessity, because staying meant waking up each morning in a house where my accomplishments were brushed aside like background noise. I worked long hours, changed jobs when I needed to, and saved like a miser, turning down vacations and impulse splurges because I wanted something permanent, something they could not claim, borrow, or redirect. The day I signed the papers on a 5-bedroom house, standing with a pen in my hand while the real estate agent congratulated me, I felt a rush that was part pride and part defiance, because this was more than a purchase. It was a fortress built brick by brick out of every hour of overtime, every ignored insult, and every bitter holiday where I sat through speeches about how Melanie's potential mattered more than my present reality. When my parents first came to see the place, I had foolishly hoped for a moment of recognition, a sliver of acknowledgement that maybe I had built something worth admiring. Instead, they walked through the wide kitchen and the high-ceilinged living room with the air of inspectors evaluating a property for someone else. My father nodded slowly, not with pride but calculation, as though he were already measuring the rooms against another life. My mother murmured polite phrases, careful not to look me in the eye for too long. And then came the first of many remarks. "This is far too big for you alone. A woman like you doesn't need all this space. Imagine how perfect this would be for Melanie once she settles down." The words were wrapped in a smile, but the implication was sharp enough to cut through me. I had worked for years to prove my independence, and in one sentence, he transformed it into a staging ground for his golden child's future. I tried to laugh it off, pretending it was just his usual tone-deaf commentary, but it was clear the idea had already taken root in his mind. Every visit after that carried some variation on the same theme. He would stand by the stairs and remark how nice it would be for children to run up and down them, though he never meant mine. He would glance at the guest bedrooms and say they were wasted on dust when they could hold a growing family, though he never envisioned mine. Once, he even asked if I had considered how generous it would be, how meaningful, if I offered the house to my sister as a wedding gift. I remember answering that generosity should be voluntary, not assigned like jury duty, but he brushed me off with a dismissive wave, as though my resistance was temporary, a tantrum he could outlast. It was during this period that the fragments of the secret I had overheard years earlier began to reassemble with sharper edges. My mother's late-night words, "She's not yours in the way you believe," echoed more forcefully as I watched my father campaign for Melanie's comfort with a zeal that bordered on desperation. I had stumbled across further proof one evening while helping my mother sift through old boxes in the attic. In a stack of brittle envelopes tied with twine, I found a letter written in a hand that wasn't my father's, addressed to my mother in the early years of her marriage. The sentences were tender, almost pleading, and though it never spelled everything outright, the meaning was impossible to miss. I had read enough to know that Melanie had been born into a silence too heavy for anyone to break, and that silence had been carried like a shadow ever since. I slid the letter back where I had found it and said nothing, because timing mattered more than outrage. Still, knowledge changes posture, and from then on I looked at my father differently. Every time he spoke of fairness while tilting the scales, every time he praised Melanie's smallest effort as though she were curing disease, every time he ignored what I had built to spotlight what she might someday attempt, I saw not authority but fragility. The desperate clinging of a man who suspected that the foundation beneath his family pride was made of sand. I understood then why my mother rarely argued. She had been carrying the secret like a porcelain bowl, terrified of dropping it, terrified of what the shards would reveal. I kept silent too, but my silence had a different purpose. It was not fear, it was strategy. Let him believe I was still the dutiful daughter, still bound by the old rules, still willing to sacrifice at the appointed hour. Let him think his grip was firm, because that would make the eventual break so much more devastating. And as I stood in the echo of my new house, listening to his voice assigning my rooms to people who had never paid for a brick, I felt the weight of the secret pressing at the edges of my patience, reminding me that when the right moment came, my words would not just defend what was mine, they would detonate everything he thought he owned. The idea that I should simply hand over the house ripened in my father's mind like fruit on a stubborn tree, and by the time Melanie's engagement party rolled around, it had become a mission statement disguised as paternal wisdom, which is how I found myself standing beside a table of wilting appetizers while he held a glass like a microphone, thanked everyone for coming, offered a toast that managed to include the words sacrifice, family, and doing what's right, and then, with a genial flourish that did not quite mask the steel underneath, praised my success in terms that sounded supportive until the final turn where he explained that success gave me a special opportunity to be foundational for my sister's new life. I watched faces tilt in my direction and registered the polite half-smiles, the nods that said the crowd could be persuaded to view magnanimity as the only respectable choice, and I wondered how many of them had paid for their siblings' mortgages with a smile. And a paper napkin. I did not interrupt, because I had already decided that if this was theater it would be mine by the end of the night, and because the best way to spoil a script written without you is to let the playwright believe the ending is inevitable. In the weeks beforehand, I had done my quiet homework, not out of malice, but out of self-defense, because it seemed obvious that the demand would escalate from suggestion to expectation and then to public decree. And when people declare your generosity in front of witnesses they are not asking, they are drafting you, so I made sure that every important document regarding my property was locked behind digital keys only I controlled, that my spare set of house keys was with a friend who would never answer family calls, and that an automatic alert notified me if someone tried to file any change of title requests without my permission. None of that would stop a determined breach of boundaries masquerading as love. But it meant that any trespass would leave footprints, and I took comfort in knowing that the house itself would not buckle under a speech. Melanie, buoyant and beautiful in a dress that matched the engagement ring too perfectly to be accidental, moved through the room like a hostess in training and kept making small comments with the sugar-coated audacity of someone who has never been told no, speculating aloud about where a nursery could go, wondering whether the back bedroom might make a good office for her fiancé's side business, and laughing in a way that told me she believed possession was merely a matter of timing. I answered, with a kind of amicable fog, neither agreeing nor resisting, because I wanted her to parade her assumptions in front of as many people as possible, and because every plan spoken out loud becomes a rope that can be yanked later. My mother drifted near me twice with the fragile smile she wore on holidays, the one that said she was monitoring tremors and hoping the plates would not shift. And both times she squeezed my hand as if to apologize for a disaster she could no longer delay or direct. I squeezed back, not with forgiveness exactly, but with the recognition that sometimes a person spends so long holding one secret that all their other choices warp around it. When the toasts ended and conversation swelled, my father approached with the purposeful stride he used when negotiating discounts at hardware stores, and in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest circle to hear, he declared that it was time to settle practicalities, by which he meant that he had a timeline in mind, a moving date penciled on a mental calendar, and a sentimental speech about how homes are meant for families delivered like a verdict. I looked at the ring of faces forming around us, Melanie with her expectation polished to a shine, her fiancé puffed with second-hand confidence, two aunts ready to approve whatever sounded most like unity, and a cousin whose curiosity was more honest than his restraint. And I felt the old training tug at me, the reflex to keep peace by absorbing the hit, yet over that tug rose the steady beat of the truth I had held for years, and I realized that holding it any longer was not protection, it was complicity. Still, I did not detonate in the center of the room the way a lesser plan would have urged, because I wanted my words to land on a stage constructed entirely by those who had insisted I owed them more. And because revenge is best served neither hot nor cold but at the exact temperature of their certainty, so I asked my father, with the calm of a person confirming a delivery, whether he would like to discuss deeds, taxes, and legal responsibilities in the presence of the entire family or whether he preferred a quiet corner where we could document his expectations in writing. He blinked, because bluster dislikes paperwork, and while he searched for a way to turn my question into compliance, I added, in a tone sweet enough to make nearby listeners lean in, that before we got into logistics it might be wise to review a few facts about the family ledger, the kind that never made it into toasts, but shaped the math of every sacrifice he had ever requested. He took the bait, or perhaps he could not help himself, because he raised his voice again and said there were no hidden facts, only obligations, and that a good daughter understands when her father asks for help. Which is when I finally decided to stop giving him the courtesy of his delusions and start giving him the dignity of the truth. Yet, even then I let one more small revenge unfurl. I turned to Melanie and asked her, kindly and clearly, whether she truly wanted a home that would forever remind her that it had not been earned but extracted, and whether she could build a marriage on walls taken from her sister by public pressure dressed up as love. Her laugh was airy, her answer glib, something about family sharing everything. And the room rewarded her with sympathetic coos, but the coos turned down to a hush when I smiled in the way that means a door is about to open. I set my glass down, told my father that generosity cannot be commanded, reminded him that my house was not a community chest, and then, with all the patience finally spent and the years of lopsided arithmetic clicking into alignment, I said that if we were reviewing facts it might be kinder to do it privately, because what I had to say would change the way he looked at his golden child, and the moment the phrase left my mouth I saw realization flash across my mother's face like distant lightning. The room went still in a way that no clinking glass or nervous laugh could soften, because the words I had released carried the weight of a bomb placed gently on a dinner plate, and once they landed there was no taking them back. No polite excuse that could tuck them away as exaggeration. I had chosen each syllable with care, letting them roll out evenly, and though I smiled as if I were merely making conversation, my father's face drained of its practiced authority until the lines around his mouth sagged like curtains after a show. Melanie blinked once, then twice, confusion giving way to a flicker of panic, while my mother sat rigid with the look of someone who had rehearsed this revelation in her mind 1,000 times, but had prayed that the curtain would never rise. The silence was not empty, it was thick, charged with the invisible current of every suppressed suspicion that now stood uninvited at the table. For a heartbeat, I considered softening the blow, telling them that I did not mean it literally, that I had only spoken in anger, but the thought passed as quickly as it arrived, because I had spent too many years bending my back to protect their illusions, and I would not stoop again. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let the truth settle, knowing that the room would divide itself according to who could tolerate reality and who needed the dream to remain intact. My father opened his mouth twice, the sound caught in his throat both times, before finally demanding to know what I meant, his voice stripped of the booming authority he usually wielded. I met his stare without flinching and reminded him that not all family secrets stay buried, that sometimes they grow roots so deep they push through the floorboards and crack the house from within. Melanie's fiancé shifted in his seat, suddenly less sure of the foundation he was marrying into, while the cousins exchanged quick, guilty glances, each one weighing the risk of siding with me against the comfort of staying loyal to the patriarch. My mother pressed a napkin to her lips, but her hands trembled so violently that the fabric quivered like a flag in the wind, and in that trembling I saw the confirmation I needed, the silent confession of someone who had carried a truth alone for too long. I did not provide details, not yet, because I wanted my father to wrestle with the possibility before anyone handed him a conclusion, and as he turned pale and demanded again to know if I was lying, I merely said that lies are heavy things to carry for decades, and that perhaps he should ask himself why my words had pierced him so deeply if there were no wound there already. The chaos that followed was not loud at first. It was the sound of whispers, of hurried conversations at the edges of the room, of relatives excusing themselves to the kitchen under the pretense of helping with dessert, as though leaving their chairs might shield them from the fallout. Melanie finally found her voice and accused me of cruelty, of jealousy, of orchestrating the scene to ruin her special night, but her anger lacked conviction because even she could feel the ground tilting beneath her feet. I answered only with a calm suggestion that she might want to speak with our mother in private when the evening ended, because some answers can't be shouted across a crowded room, and I left it at that. My father, who had always relied on certainty as his armor, tried once more to reassert control, insisting that nothing I said mattered, that he knew his family and knew his children, but the words rang hollow. And for the first time in my life I saw him not as a man to defy, but as a man cornered by the possibility that his kingdom had been built on borrowed bricks. He slammed his hand against the table, not in fury, but in a futile attempt to reassemble the authority already shattered, and when no one rushed to fill the silence, the truth became heavier than any denial he could muster. I did not wait for the next round of accusations or the inevitable demands for proof, because I had never intended to spend the night debating bloodlines. My revenge was not in the detail, it was in the fracture, in the way a single sentence had cracked open the shell of certainty he wore like armor. So I stood, smoothed my dress, and thanked everyone for the evening in the same even tone one might use when leaving a polite luncheon, and I walked out with my head held high, leaving behind a room where the air still quivered with unspoken questions. On the drive home, the night seemed quieter than usual, the hum of the tires steady against the pavement, and I thought about what would follow: phone calls, confrontations, maybe even cold silence for weeks or months. But none of it weighed me down, because for the first time I felt the burden shift, the secret no longer mine to carry alone, and whether they hated me or finally understood me, they would never again look at me as the expendable daughter whose life could be drafted for someone else's comfort. I did not know if the truth would bring healing or ruin, but I did know this. It had finally given me the distance I needed, and the freedom to choose who I wanted to be without the chains of their expectations. Perhaps that is the cruelest kind of revenge, not in watching them crumble, but in watching them realize that I have stepped outside their grasp forever, leaving them with a silence they must fill on their own. And whether they ever forgive me, or I forgive them, is not the question that keeps me up at night anymore. The real question, the one that lingers in the quiet moments, is whether they will ever learn to forgive themselves.